Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Nampo virtual webinar from Pioneer. Thank you very much for joining us. Today, our marketing manager, Germa Kieser, will be chatting to Professor Ferdi Meyer from BFAB to just give us a market overview of what's going on currently and for the future. So over to you, Germa.
Okay, maybe unmute will help. Morning, Professor. It's a privilege to have you here with us today to give us a bit of insights into the long-term BFAB projections for summer grains. In BFAB's first brief on the possible impact of COVID on agricultural back in March, you already projected that 2020 will be a year of growth for the agricultural sector, and more specifically the summer grain sector. To what extent have these projections materialized, and how does this affect the outlook for the coming season?
Yeah, good morning, and good morning to all the listeners. It's a great privilege to talk to you this morning. And indeed, it's actually, it's great to talk about summer grains and field crops in South Africa at this time of year and the specific year where, despite of all the hardship that we've seen in the due to COVID, agriculture, the shining light, as we've put it in our base in August. And this projection was done actually in March, where there was a big concern around economic activity, the impact of COVID-19. And we were very lucky in the sense that agriculture already classified as essential service right at the start. So although there were some bottlenecks initially with the supply chain issues, and we know about those kind of logistics, and we have very complex supply chains in food. Sometimes you think about this main, the artery of product flow of food, maize being harvested, going to the elevators, the processors, and towards the retailers. But a lot of times we think about all these small supply chains that are feeding into agriculture. And although there was some confusion and bottlenecks in the initial lockdown regulations, it didn't really affect agriculture that much over in the broader scheme of things. So the big reason for this big growth in this season is mainly summer crops and specific maize that has done exceptionally well. 0.5 million tons of a harvest, and we can see the spike there also on our area planting graph. We actually had good plantings of white maize. In total, maize hectares were good, and then suddenly, with a combination of a weak exchange rate plus very favorable weather conditions, gave us a combination of a crop which is the highest ever. So although the tonnages are at 15.5 million, which is the second largest crop in the history of South Africa, if you take the price into consideration with the rapid depreciation that we've had due to uncertainty in the world market, we have the largest crop in terms of value. And that has really made a big contribution. Sunflower crop, soya, the biggest. We've had a much bigger crop in 2017, but still at 1.2 million tons times a good price for soya, a good price for sunflower, and the result is actually a very good harvest in this season. And I think what we really need to articulate is in how important this crop is in a year where a lot of people lose their jobs. The basic staple remains maize meal. And we've seen actually milling numbers over the last 4 or 5 months. Total amount of maize that has been milled has increased by 3,000 tons. So you actually see, and that's actually the sad part of COVID, is we see people losing jobs and they switch back into a basic staple like maize meal. And therefore, it's really a blessing that we have major surplus crop, and we're actually helping our neighbors. Zimbabwe has their GM regulation exports, and we're exporting volumes into the Zimbabwean market currently, and it's actually much higher than the previous seasons because they can choose, they would not a GM, and that's the old regulation that we can talk in a moment's time. But in principle, are running well. White maize mainly into our neighboring countries where food demand is high, and then obviously deep yellow maize exports. So, and then there still remains the issue around local food consumption and then human consumption. Overall, Germa, it gives us a picture for this year. And I think can consider now is the way forward. What do the projections look like for the next 10 years? And in this graph that we've presented to the colleagues who have tuned into this presentation, you can see actually that the top line, that's the area of white maize production. So just have a look at the historic trend. From 2000, we've actually consistently lost hectares under white maize. And then the second line is actually our yellow maize area. And there we've basically maintained the area under yellow maize. Both of these industries have gained significant in terms of yields per hectare. So what's happening is we are managing to meet our local requirement or the requirement of white maize just by increasing yields. In other words, intensifying, becoming more productive. But in the case of yellow maize, the demand for feed is growing faster than in the human market. And therefore, we actually have increasing trend in yellow area. And obviously, the big, fast-growing, the new kid on the block remains soya. If we track that light blue graph from the 2000, where we had very small plantings of soybeans, maybe 100,000 hectares, later on 200,000, and then suddenly when we had the crushing plants built, the big investment in 2 million tons of crushing facilities, then really only soybeans took off. And saw those hectares expanding rapidly. And you can see our projection for the 2021 season is actually a significant expansion, a further expansion in soybean area. And towards the long run, our model projects that our area will end up around about 1 million hectares of soybeans. Currently, we are at 750,000, or the next season 782 or 87,000 hectares, and then expanding to 1 million. Now, listeners will obviously query, why do our outlook lines look so straight and flat? They kind of just give this long-term trend over the next 10 years, and compared to the past where we see a lot of stability. And that is the nature of these projection models. We assume normal weather conditions. So what you see here is actually an equilibrium of economic realities. And then if we can run the model stochastically, and you can actually look at the variability over time, if we would, for example, introduce climate. But overall, the picture, Germa, remains a picture where your feed grains and oilseeds grow faster than grains used in the human consumption space.
Sure, Ferdi, thank you for that. It gives me specifically a lot to think about. Before we continue to the next question, I would just like to ask everybody, if you've got any question for Prof. Ferdi, please post it in the chat box. As soon as we ran through all these questions, we will go through your questions. So please, if there's anything that you would like to ask him, this is interactive. Post it on the chat box for us. Professor Nex, how does BFAB see the demand changing in both the human and the feed market over the medium to long run? And what could possibly make this picture look different?
I think this is a very important one, Germa, where we actually look at the total demand in different value chains and in different markets. So we talked about, I hinted just in the direction of, feed demand is growing faster than your human consumption of staples. So in the feed demand space, obviously what is your pull for grain is on the livestock side. And this is really the determining factor going forward. How fast will our demand for feed grow, which is actually derived demand? How fast will the demand for meat grow? And specifically, the largest industries are the broilers, the poultry industry. Now, and we've seen a lot of that also in the media, is in terms of, can we replace more imported broiler or chicken meat with local production? And currently, or in the recent months, a master plan for the poultry industry has been agreed upon between government and private sector and labor, where they've identified specific targets to enhance local production of broiler meat. And that additional demand due to increased level of local production will certainly assist our demand in the demand for feed. So looking at our numbers, our long run projections, let's just take compare last 10 years with the next 10 years for broiler meat. And we do see a slowdown due to the COVID long-term impacts. And this is where really the COVID impact on our economy. Our economy was growing slow, and now we have this additional burden of really rebuilding a economy. And this is also where we need to make a distinction between the formal and the informal. So on the formal side, your broiler meat, if we take the total, well, let's start off with a total of formal and informal. It has grown by 25% over the last 10 years, the demand for broiler meat. And our projection is that it will only grow 12% over the next 10 years. That is due to the slower growth in the economy and job, etc., that we really need. And that's under the baseline. If we could get some of these interventions right in the master plan, for example, some real activities going in the economy, in other sectors that are much agriculture, where we actually can create jobs, that projection can pick up. But in the baseline, it is slower. Then if we look at beef, we are comparing, we've had a very interesting industry or cycle in the beef sector, where we've had a rapid expansion in beef demand when the economy was still growing faster in the early, let's say, 2010 to 2015. But in the last 4 or 5 years, we've already seen this contraction of or a slower growth in the economy. On top of that, we've had much higher beef prices. And the reason for that was the drought. So we've had rapid slaughterings and then the contraction of beef and the supply of beef, and we had prices going up. And suddenly you actually saw a decline in beef consumption the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years. So it's a combined effect. We do see beef growing about another 12%. And then we have smaller industries that are growing fast. For example, pork. Pork has expanded by 42% in the last 10 years. So that's an amazing number. Just think about it. Pork consumption grew by 42% in the last 10 years. That's 4% per annum. And we're still projecting fast growth in that space of about 20%. So that's really good. Eggs, this 27% growth in the last 10 years, another 24% added in the next 10 years. So Germa, at the end of the day, this all relates back to the demand for feed and actually the demand for our summer grains, specifically your big ones, your maize and your soya. So the question will now be, how can we really get this growth to be faster? And this currently is happening in the master plan, to unpack and also to bring more of the informal market, to support that market, because we have such big opportunity in that market space where we have lower productivity in the smallholder side. Smallholder farmers really require much more support, extension services, access to markets. And we've had plenty of examples where these public-private partnerships are really working well. And these smallholder farmers have so much more productivity. And if we have that, surplus becomes actually available in the informal feed market. And suddenly you're working with a totally different ballgame. So I talked about pork growth a moment ago. Now we've been tracking that more carefully. In the informal market, that growth is even faster. So we're currently working on calculations where we're estimating that the estimation of agriculture contribution to the economy, it's underestimated because we don't have good numbers and we don't really take the value of the informal sector and the smallholder sector into consideration in all our numbers. So what we're trying to do at BFAB and various research partners that we're working with to get a better understanding of how can we get a better grip and support in this informal sector.
And this trend that you've just explained is for sure something from a seed supply point of view that we will have to keep a close watch on to see where everything is going. Professor, you know climate is on everybody's mind. So how will the climate change potentially impact the long-term cropping patterns?
Yeah, Germa, over the years doing all this modeling and trend analysis, I have a rule of thumb, and my rule says there's about 200,000 hectares in the western part of the country, far west, Free State, northwest, where marginal land struggles to compete under when prices fall or export parity. And we've seen that. So we see those areas moving in and out depending on what the price level is. But farmers are also making huge amount of progress on rotational cropping. We see a lot of more combination tillage, and our projection is that the area in the west will remain under pressure. We will actually see a lot more crop, or for example, pastures entering the crop space. In other words, expanding, bringing in pastures and planted pastures and a bigger livestock component as part of your field crop operation to mitigate the risk of climate. That's specifically in the dry land, summer grain area where our biggest concerns are. But climate also implies more erratic events. Now, ourselves, I have a farming background, we're still in the family farm, and we see these events, producers, if you talk to them, they are constantly adapting to climate. But these last 5 years, if you analyze rainfall, we've carefully done statistics as far as you can go back to the last 100 years. You can see these last 5 years were exceptionally dry, and we had these exceptional events. So the importance of rotational cropping, cover, and this integration, as I mentioned, of pastures, the diversification of risk becomes so much more important to apply. And then obviously that speaks also to the amount of irrigation, the effectiveness of and the efficiency of use of irrigation. Our estimates are lose about 30% between the or the source of water and the farm gate. Infrastructure is required, the investment in these channels and the water irrigation systems, on the farm efficiency in terms of automatic probes, scheduling of irrigation, becomes so much more important. So our water is really under pressure, and we will have to look at it very carefully.
Thanks for that information. And then lastly, the African Free Trade Agreement. What could possibly be the impact of that on the summer grains and oilseed sector?
Yeah, we can talk about this for a whole day. The African continent is an amazing place to be, and we really need to have careful consideration in terms of our value chains, the opportunities can grow and supply products in the continent, in the value chain and services that we can offer. But also, there's competition coming in terms of grains, for example. Germa, if we look at the rapid expansion in production in Zambia, for example, we have seen the expansion in Malawi, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia has expanded their basic staples very quickly. But a lot of that expansion has been in hectares. So we've seen a net expansion of hectares, and in some countries we've seen higher yields. So in other words, intensification. But what is interesting, we've written a little bit about this research in a publication that we call Hitting the Wall. And what is happening in a country like Zambia, they've rapidly expanded, filled the gap of imports. Now they are producers, and the question is where to with their product. So they're actually having a surplus of maize. They'll do a surplus in this year. Their local consumption is about 2.3 million tons. They're going to produce a maize crop of about 3 million tons. So they have a surplus of about 600,000 tons of maize. first neighboring countries like DRC supply, they do the northern part of Zimbabwe, and they'll supply into Kenya. So if you look at trade patterns, whereas Zimbabwe was always a very reliable export market for us when GM is not an issue, when they open that up. Now it's actually becoming a situation where we're competing with Zambian maize into Zimbabwe in a number of years. And remember, Zambia is non-GM. So then, you see a lot more flow into that Zimbabwean market. So over time, we know that there's a huge growth in population across the continent. The demand for food is going to increase rapidly. There's huge demand for agriculture transformation, structural transformation, in other words, investing in processing plants, silos, infrastructure beyond the farm gate. And I think our agriculture and agro-processing sector, together, private sector, government, we need to take a very strategic position in the evolution of our continent to see how can we be part of this growth in the continent and supporting the countries and understanding what are our opportunities, but also to be aware that we will get more competition going forward as these markets evolve.
Thank you for that insight. I see we have 2 questions for you so far in the chat box. Charles wants to know, what is a non-commercial maize?
Yeah, so non-commercial, we have a split, and the Crop Estimates Committee, this is actually the only field crop where they do make a distinction. And the one is, so we have this 15.5 million ton, that's the official commercial crop estimate. And then there's a non-commercial maize estimate, and this is basically by the smallholder sector. And most of this maize does not end up in the commercialized value chain, but a lot of it is used for on-farm use, own use in the household, and maybe just around the household. And that number currently stands at around, if I remember correctly, this year it's just under 500,000 tons on about 240, 250,000 hectares. So those are kind of the averages that we see every year. And Germa, that's the space that I've been talking about earlier in this presentation, is that's where we have huge potential. So these are already farmers, experience. A lot of times these farmers are actually on very good soils, good climate conditions. But those soils there needs to be a correction done. For example, liming of soils. The time inputs, to have inputs time at their farm gate, that they can best seed, the best fertilizer, and have access to credit. So those are all type of programs. We've seen many successes in recent years, these public-private partnerships, where you actually get farmers linked into a commercialized value. So, and it's all about definitions here. It's, when you become commercial, the moment that you actually sell something. When you have a surplus that you can sell, it flows into a commercialized value chain. Now, and this is where our view is, there's not a one size fits all. We need to respect and understand these different nature of value chains in South Africa. We have formal and we have informal value chains and different markets, and that's great. We need to understand and support all of these informal value chains. What is required for faster growth is more infrastructure development, places where you have storage, where you can aggregate volumes of trade in bigger spaces, where there can be a big off-taker. So there are different solutions that one can find in this, but I think the bottom line is there are these different chains. We need to be aware of that and really customize support for these different chains.
Charles, I hope that answered your question. And then Jaco also want to know from you, do you have any confirmation on possible yield decrease on the current US corn crop? Do you have any insights on that?
Repeat that, Germa? You broke up for a moment.
Do you have any confirmation on the possible yield decrease on the current US corn crop?
Yeah, goodness, that's always this is the critical period of time in the main the international corn space, and a lot of times one is nervous about these crop reports that come out where you see some potential crop damages. The reports that we get from the ground show that the impact of these negative events that we've seen, for example, the extreme weather, hasn't been big enough that we won't see really a big impact on yields, and there's still a good crop coming. And I think overall, if we look at stock levels globally, they're still very high. So in our predictions, we don't think that any current events that they've taken place in the recent 2 or 3 weeks will have a significant impact on prices or absolute stock levels. They're still high. They might be a little bit lower than initial projections, but still at relatively high levels.
Professor, I can only speak on behalf of myself, but the information you shared gave me so much hope for the long-term summer grain sector today. And I know all of our farmers will greatly benefit from this message on how to manage their grains going forward. So thank you very much. Tareen, over to you.
Thank you, everyone that joined us today. It was really great to have you on this call. A recording of this webinar will be available shortly under the video links on our Nampo stand. Enjoy the rest of Nampo Virtual and join us again tomorrow morning at 11 for another webinar. Have a lovely day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Tareen. Thank you, Ferdi, once again. We really appreciate it.